Hello everybody, today you're joining me for the next installment in my hunt for my new daily driver. The 1 Series is either gone or going by the time you watch this, and I need something to kind of fill the gap. I need a car which is going to be the other car on the fleet, the one for my sort of daily driven, ordinary carrying people or staff kind of duties, or when the weather isn't really good enough or right to enjoy any of my other cars. In the first part of this series, I drove an Alfa Romeo 156 GTA sport wagon, but concluded although it was a very desirable car, it wasn't going to be the right one for me. There were a number of reasons that the Alfa wasn't quite the right car, and if you want to know what those were, go and check out that video. But today's vehicle on paper might seem similar, but in practice it's about as different as you could get. It is also an estate car with around 250 horsepower, actually a little bit less here, but that's pretty much where the differences end. You could say there are some similarities in that both have an unusual badge on them, one being the Alfa Romeo and this being a Subaru. It's an odd case of affairs where a Subaru is ever the sensible proposition, but when you compare it with the Alfa, that's exactly what this is. So, what are we looking at today? Well, this is a Subaru Legacy 3.0R Spec.B. Yes, the Japanese do love their slightly odd names for cars, but that's what we have. Now, this is a car that is most definitely not JDM. In fact, you couldn't buy one of these in Japan. You could get yourself a Legacy, you could even get a Spec.B, but it wouldn't have had this engine in. What you'd have got is a 2.5 litre flat 4 boxer, the kind of engine you normally associate with Subaru. But this has a flat 6. It's an interesting engine configuration that does have some benefits. It's nice and low, is naturally balanced, fairly short compared of course to a straight 6, but beyond the world of Porsche, we don't really see flat 6s. That's probably for a few reasons. They are a devil to package, being very wide. You also can't really design a car around a boxer engine unless you know all of the engines are going to be boxers, because it's a very, very different layout, mechanically speaking, to a straight 4 or a V. So, in terms of what I'm looking for, how would the Legacy stack up? It's actually a car I've been interested in for quite some time, and for very good reason. First off, it's unusual, and whatever I buy, I'd like to be something a little bit different. I don't want to just go and buy another 3 Series or something like that, because I'd almost feel like a bit of a failure as a car YouTuber, and a car YouTuber that prides themselves on loving the unloved. I do have a major soft spot for Subarus. I've often wanted to buy another Impreza, but the fact is, as a daily driver, the Impreza I don't think will cut it. It's a little bit compromised in terms of space, it's very compromised in terms of reliability, and I already have my rally replica in the form of the Celica GT4. Incidentally, if you are watching from America, a couple of things I want to point out. First off, Celica is how we say that. We don't say Celica. I've never heard anyone in Great Britain call it a Toyota Celica. Sorry, that's just how it is. You call them Jaguars, I'm going to call them Celicas. Fair? Secondly, it's pretty hard to explain just how rare a Subaru actually is here. And indeed, if you're living in Britain watching this, which 80% of you are, then it's kind of hard to understand quite how popular Subaru is in other parts of the world. From a British perspective, it'd be very easy to wonder how Subaru are even still in business. Yet in the States, particularly the sort of northern bits where they do get snow on a fairly frequent basis, they're a very, very popular car. Here though, Subaru is just a sort of perfect storm of things nobody really wants anymore. Reasonably thirsty cars, interiors that are just a little bit out of date, all-wheel drive was until recently something no one really cared about, and a brand that people have no lusting for. If you're spending money here, you want to buy German. Consequently, there are even fewer Subaru dealers in this country, which means things are even more difficult if you want to get your car serviced, worked on, or so on and so forth. As it happens, this car, I believe, was supplied by my old chums at Bell & Colville down in Surrey. So in purely practical terms, how does the Legacy stack up, particularly against the Alfa Romeo, which is now the benchmark? Well, actually, very well. It's not the most stylish thing to look at, is it really? It's quite a slab-sided, unexciting affair, but that's not an insurmountable issue for me when it comes to the daily driver. There is something to be said for a car which doesn't scream, "Look at me." Petrolheads will still know what this is, and that I like. It's also got a fair bit more space in it than the Alfa. A bit more room in the back seats, where the Alfa did struggle, and again, quite a bit more room in the boot. Nice, big, large, fairly flat floor, which means when I'm setting up my cameras and stuff like that, it's a really good work surface to have, and that I do like. Also, from a filming perspective, this car's great. There's so much glass in it, both along the side and above me, that I can stick a camera basically wherever I like. You can get these with either a manual or an automatic gearbox. This one is the rarer manual, and it's actually a very nice box to use. It's a 6-speed, a development of the 6-speed unit used in the Impreza, and in Subaru land, the 6-speed is the one to have. The 5-speed is made of glass and broken dreams. It's not identical to the unit found in the Impreza though. Subaru allegedly did a lot of work to the gearbox internally and externally, making it not just work with this car, but also more appropriate for the Legacy. This is a grown-up Subaru, so the whole thing's a little bit more refined and less raw and rally car for the road. In fact, in here you do get this sort of Japanese luxury vibe, and it smells like a Japanese car. I know, difficult thing to explain, but if you've been in a Japanese car of this kind of era, you know, late 90s, early noughties, you'll know exactly what I mean. The engine is buttery smooth. Clutch is actually quite difficult to modulate. I have stalled this car a couple of times already. That's not something that I often do, but I have in here. The gearbox itself, really quite nice. Subaru gearboxes often are. And this car does actually have an aftermarket exhaust on it, a Fox item, and I wouldn't really know, because if you told me to guess, I'd say that this is standard. It's not a shouty car, this one, at all. Compared with the Alfa, it feels like a much more cohesive interior. The Alfa had bits which were really nice and bits which were not so nice, but this one feels like it's all been designed at the same time by the same people. They are from pretty much the same time period, sort of, you know, mid-2000s or thereabouts. You can get these for a little bit cheaper, so you could pick up a decent Legacy of this generation for about 10 grand. And that means that they are pretty much smack bang in where my budget would ideally be. I keep winding up looking at cars at 30,000 quid, and the truth is I don't have 30,000 quid to spend on a car. 10 to 15 is really where I should be. Maybe, if I want to finance something, yeah, I could get sort of 20 to 25, but I don't want to finance the daily driver. I want to own it. That's kind of the point, so I can do whatever I like with it and don't really have to worry about it. Plus, if you're financing something, you're spending money on it every month, and that then entirely defeats the point of having something which is supposed to cost you less money. The ride in here is very different to the Alfa Romeo, as in fact is the steering. The Alfa was a darty little so-and-so, albeit slightly soft on the dead ahead. It had a very quick steering rack in it and was trying to be desperately sporty. Okay, now that is cool. Reg plate PHO211. That's awesome. Like that. The Alfa was also very stiff. I know that one had an aftermarket suspension on it, but it was one that's supposed to be very much in tune with that car's needs, and it was somewhat punishing. It never really quite backed off and always felt just a little bit harsh. That really was a strike against it for me, because I want my daily driver to be something that's a little bit relaxing to drive, and this really is. We're about to drop onto one of my favourite B roads, which is the natural hunting ground of the Subaru. However, we'll see if the Legacy can fare just as well as an Impreza can. I love the fact this car has a sunroof. That's something I do really like in a car. It's got 5 doors, it's got plenty of space. It does have a very old-fashioned display here, and you've got the little sort of radio, stereo and AC stuff down here. I'm sure there must be a way, there appears to be space to put a double-din head unit in, because one of my criteria is I must be able to fit Android Auto to whatever it is that I get. And this is an issue because a lot of the cars I'm looking at are about 10 years old, and they'll have infotainment systems like the BMW where they're sort of hardwired in, and it's very difficult to upgrade them or replace them without wrecking the car. Here we go. It's an extremely composed car, this. Not the most dynamic though. You can really feel the fact that that entire 6-cylinder engine up front is ahead of the axle line. And that means that the front nose really does dictate policy here. It's not a deal-breaking issue in terms of a daily driver. If you were looking for something more exciting, if you're expecting this to be just a slightly larger Impreza, you're going to be very disappointed. Truth be told, actually, the Impreza has a similar issue. It's still very nose-led, but deals with it in a very different way. Steering in here is actually pretty decent too. Not brilliant, but I'd say at least the equal of the Alfa. It's a little slower for sure, but it's got a nice consistent weighting to it and a very linear response. It means that the car does kind of what you tell it to. You just have to be wary of that heavy front end. As you might expect, this car has Subaru's trademark permanent all-wheel drive system, and that I'd say is another tick for me because it means the car is just going to be that little bit more usable all year round. It's chilly out there, chillier, trust me, than it looks, but this car's doing fairly well. It's doing what I'd want. You know, on a road like this, in a daily driver, I don't need more pace. 240, 250 horsepower is ample. I know I say that, knowing full well I'm probably going to wind up buying a 500 horsepower screaming nutter monstermobile as my new daily. But I'd like to think that I would settle for something like this. The petrolhead curse. In fairness, I'm quite enjoying this series because it's me getting a chance to be just as difficult to myself as other people can be. I'll get people messaging me all the time asking for advice on what car they should buy, and sometimes it's very easy to sort of help people, point them in the right direction or whatever. Other times it's more difficult because you do get some people that come to you and they're asking questions to which you just can't give them an answer, either because the car doesn't exist or because the solution is obvious and they're just not willing to accept it. For example, you'll often get people that have got a 911 and they say they want something else that's not a 911, but when they describe to you their actual needs, what they want's a 911. Porsche people are like that. They'll have a 911, they'll say they want anything but a 911, they'll go and look at all the alternatives, then they'll just wind up buying another 911. They'll come to me and say, James, I want to buy something, and I really don't want a 911, but what I would like is a sort of 2+2 rear-engine sports car, sort of started production in about 1963 or so, sort of built in the really southern area of Germany if possible, maybe with 6 cylinders, perhaps horizontally opposed, and with a 3-digit numerical name, but I don't want a 911. What am I to do with that? It does seem to be a little bit of a wobble in this car, which I will report back to its owner. Nothing really severe or to worry about, probably just a wheel balance issue, something along those lines. Generally though, it's very nice. Brakes, certainly compared to the Alfa Romeo, do require a really rather hefty shove to get them to do their thing. And because it is a naturally aspirated engine, it's got reasonable torque, but does rev out nicely. Very, very linear, very progressive. It's also a car that's well sized for these kind of roads. I've considered things like, say, a Merc E63. Again, that would be a very thirsty car, probably very expensive to run. It's almost certain to break at some point, and I think it could wind up being just a bit too much, just in every regard really. Gearbox is an area where I'm still very much undecided, because as much as I want to say, yes, I want a manual, actually there are plenty of times when, no, I don't want a manual. This manual, I think I could live with. It's very easy to use. It's a sweet gearbox, and I'd probably be annoyed if I got the auto knowing that this was an option. I think the auto from this era is going to be just a little bit dim-witted. Some auto boxes of this age are actually pretty good, some just not. Let's do a little manoeuvring test, because this is the kind of thing I'm going to have to do on a frequent basis. So this is also reversing uphill. Clutch engagement, yeah, is tricky, really tricky. Visibility is good though, yeah. You move the clutch a lot further than you think, then the biting point is very, very narrow window of engagement. And we're off again. This little screen up here gives you all sorts of information about the car. My favourite bit is that there's a screen which tells you information about the battery, tyre pressures and so on and so forth, and even the timing belt, and it just says undecided below several of those. That's Andy Subaru. Cheers. Fuel economy, not stellar. This car's reported an average of, drumroll please, 24.3. Not good, is it? And here's where it gets tricky. I don't mind a car that only does that as an average, but I do mind a car that has only just over 240 horsepower and does that as an average. If I had a 500 horsepower V8 and it did 24 to the gallon, I'd be very happy with it. I'd be fine, delightful, lovely. But yeah, I just can't. I mentioned in the previous video that I have a 3 strikes policy. In other words, there are 3 criteria I have the car can fail on before I just rule the thing out of the running entirely. The Subaru, if I'm trying to think of 3 strikes against it, well, the interior is not particularly nice. I'm not even sure that's a whole strike, but let's just say it is. The interior is not particularly nice. And the fuel economy is not that great. But that, I think, is it, because it's got plenty of the rest of what I need. It's got the space, it's an interesting offbeat car, it's comfortable. I could do long distances in this very happily. And so actually, I think the Subaru is going to be one of the first cars to go into the list of, yes, this is a legitimate contender. I very much like it. It is, like all of the cars Lorenzo's ever brought to me, in very good condition. And I remain eternally grateful to him and all of the other people that bring me cars to drive. Red line is 7,000 RPM. I don't think there's really much in the way of tuning you can do with these, and knowing Subarus as I do, I would say that tuning is something you'd want to actively avoid. If this car does have an Achilles heel in dynamic terms, it's the brakes. I actually finished my filming already, and I've recorded this as an extra segment. I got out to get all the cameras off the car, and there was the most enormous whiff of brake pad. This car was not happy with being driven the way it was, and I didn't think I was really pressing on that hard. Evidently, that was about as much as the brakes were willing to take. Funnily enough, this is the same thing that you'd find with an Impreza WRX. The brakes just not quite up to snuff. It's again another thing that happens when you've got a car that's so front heavy, it just leans on that front end that much more. So if you do want to buy one of these and drive it in an enthusiastic fashion, be prepared to have to upgrade the brakes. So, what's next to try? I don't know, but if you've got a suggestion, more importantly, if you've got a car that you think fits the bill, maybe you're even thinking of selling it, and it's a large saloon, an estate, or an SUV under about £20,000, and you think I'd be interested in it, please do give me a shout, because I'd love to try your car and see if it could be another potential for my next daily. As it is though, the Legacy I've actually really quite enjoyed. A lot of people have said to me that the Legacy's a bit of a pudding to drive, and yeah, okay, if you compare it to an Impreza, it's not that sharp, but I wasn't going into it expecting it to be that sharp. I was going into it expecting a more grown-up, rounded, more refined Subaru, and that's precisely what this is. It's not an M3 alternative or anything like that. In fact, heck, it's not really even an alternative for the Alfa. It's got such a different character. But if you want an offbeat, weird, petrolhead daily driver car, actually, compared with the Alfa, I think this is the better car. Doesn't have the passion of the Italians, and it doesn't have the flaws either, and there's still enough about it to make it interesting. So there we have it. That is the 4th generation Subaru Legacy Sports Tourer 3.0R Spec.B. Thanks to Lorenzo for bringing it. Thanks to you for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you all for the next one. Bye bye.